Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and finally I get to make this video. Obviously, typically I upload earlier than this, but just the scenarios of the trade deadline that have been happening have caused me to push this off because last night it seemed like there was an Andre Iguodala to the Heat trade that was essentially finalized. There was another piece of this in which Danilo Gallinari could have potentially been going to Miami, and we didn't really know the details of anything until now, so I wanted to wait until we got closer to the 3 p.m. trade deadline to actually come out with this video. And today we're going to be breaking down that Andre Iguodala trade to Miami, and figuring out what this means for the Heat now, as well as moving forward for Memphis. And there's some really interesting scenarios on both sides. But really quickly, before we get started, if you enjoyed this type of content, then consider subscribing. I upload basically every single day. Okay, so this was just a crazy situation because, like I said, last night I was just hanging out, kind of looking at some of the rumors, and suddenly it went from the Heat are exploring Andre Iguodala trades to the Heat are serious contenders for Andre Iguodala to now they're trying to get Iggy and Gallinari to they have a Winslow deal, or they have an Iguodala deal, and it involves Justise Winslow, and they're still working on the Gallinari thing. And then throughout today, it's been they're just trying to figure out an extension with Gallinari. They already have the Iguodala thing in place to go to Miami. It definitely includes Winslow, but we don't know any of the other pieces. So at this point, I was like, okay, I probably have time to go about my day and wait until closer to 3 p.m. and I'll just put out a later video. So I go to the gym, and as soon as I get back in my truck, my girlfriend and I get back in my truck to drive back home, and suddenly there's a notification that says exactly what this deal is. And it says Miami has agreed to trade Justise Winslow, Dion Waiters, and James Johnson to Memphis for Andre Iguodala, Solomon Hill, and Jay Crowder. There are no picks in the deal. So finally, we get some details on this. So let's talk about this first from Miami's perspective, and then we'll get over to Memphis because Miami has a more immediate sense in this, and then Memphis is a little bit more long-term. Okay, so for Miami, it's pretty simple. They're bringing in a player in Andre Iguodala that has championship experience, that is used to contending for championships, and when healthy, should be an important piece for them. As a defender, as an occasionally good shooter, depending on the situation, always seems to step up his game, especially in the finals as a three-point shooter, is at least respectable, and again, a defender and a fantastic veteran presence. The primary piece that they're giving up here is Justise Winslow, who is a player that is continually talented, and depending on the role that you put him in, I think potentially a really good player down the road, but has been most effective with the ball in his hands. And now with Jimmy Butler and already having guys like Goran Dragic and Tyler Hero on the roster, it was a little bit tougher for him to not only stay on the court because of his health issues, but also be effective as an on-ball player because he just wasn't getting those kinds of opportunities. So they decide to move on from him and bring in someone like Andre Iguodala. Now, the interesting part of this trade, as we talk a little bit about what Memphis is doing here, we always heard that if they were going to trade Andre Iguodala, which they seemed committed to doing because he didn't want to play for them, it was going to involve a first-round pick. And they were adamant about the fact that they knew that they could get a first-round pick, but you could argue that they got even better compensation than that because they were willing to take on some slightly long-term salaries from Miami. Now, getting back to the Heat before we get too much into the Grizzlies stuff, I do slightly question the Andre Iguodala acquisition. I understand all of the intangible stuff, right? Like the veteran presence, having that championship pedigree on your roster is extremely important, as well as what he brings on the floor. However, Winslow is a younger player, maybe slightly more dependent on the postseason in terms of his health, despite all the issues he's had staying on the floor. Maybe you could argue that's a wash, but I don't automatically think that it's a win if you're just talking about this straight up between Winslow and Iguodala, which is why it's important that there are other pieces in this deal. Solomon Hill, I'm not entirely worried about for this Heat team, might be able to play for them a little bit, but more important in this is Jay Crowder because he's another guy that I think perfectly fits what Miami is all about. It's a tough-minded organization. This is a guy that's going to be a good defender. He's going to play hard, he's going to hustle, and he's going to make occasional jump shots. He's going to be a rotation wing for them, and they're trading away two guys that really weren't all that impactful on their team to this point in the season, and Dion Waiters especially so, and James Johnson, has been there a little bit, but really not very much at all. So when you consider that, when you're adding together the Iguodala plus Crowder and a little bit of Solomon Hill, it starts to make a little bit more sense for Miami because the salaries didn't work here. But let's just say, for example, it was Winslow for Iguodala straight up. I would not have liked that deal for them, but this even adds a little bit of depth for them when you would think that it would have been the other way around and they would have been giving up depth to get Iguodala. Now, for Memphis, this is really, really interesting because, like I said, it seemed like throughout this entire process when they traded Andre Iguodala, they were going to get a first-round pick for him. And you could argue, again, as I said earlier, that they got better compensation than that because this is a Heat team that doesn't have a first-round pick to trade. They have traded away a couple of future firsts. The way the Stepien rule works, they don't have their own available this year unless they made some other moves, like with Oklahoma City, lifted the protection on that pick, and then they could possibly make some moves. Really quickly, I do want to put a disclaimer. This video is being recorded at, what time is it? 12:39 Eastern time. So if something did happen with Oklahoma City between now and when this video goes up, I have nothing to do with that. I can't help that. There are still the possibility that a Danilo Gallinari trade could be wrapped up in this before the 3 p.m. trade deadline, but I just wanted to go ahead and get this video out and talk about this. Now, getting back to Memphis. I love the Justise Winslow acquisition for them. This is a guy that I think can be a really good player, is on a cost-controlled contract, and is someone that is obviously younger than Andre Iguodala. And if he can stay healthy and stay on the floor, adds another really nice piece to this young core. And I just think that it's such a nice move for them. Now, the interesting part of this is I don't think that they could have gotten Justise Winslow for Andre Iguodala straight up. And so they ended up having to take on some salary in the form of Dion Waiters and James Johnson, not only to make the money work, but also as an added benefit to Miami, because Justise Winslow is objectively, in my opinion, a better asset than Andre Iguodala, considering the salaries, considering the fact that Winslow is locked up long term, even with the health issues that he does have. However, and I'm going to talk about this in a video once the trade deadline starts to calm down, there are some really, really interesting long-term potential effects of this for Memphis, because when you look at the salaries of Dion Waiters and James Johnson, assuming that those guys, I think one of them has a player option for next year. Both of them are going to be under contract next year because they're not going to find more money than what they are right now. They have 2 years left, this year and then next year. The expiring salaries of those two guys, whether it's for a big name player, which I'll get to in a later video, or not, are going to be assets for them next season when they could be potentially in the market for a big name acquisition, whether it's this offseason or during the year next year. And they definitely have the assets to make something like that work. Now, with Justise Winslow or Brandon Clark, or the extra first-round pick they have from Utah, they don't have their own pick this year, presumably because it is top 6 projected to Boston this year. And so they do have some pieces down the line. Again, I don't want to spoil the other video too much, to potentially make a deal. But getting back specifically to this one, I love the Winslow acquisition to add another piece to this young core. When you're talking about Jaren Jackson Jr., John Morant, Dylan Brooks, Brandon Clark, and Justise Winslow, that is a really awesome 5-man group, not to mention some of the other guys on the roster like DeAnthony Melton, Grayson Allen, that could potentially be something down the road as well. I love the versatility of Winslow. I love his defensive presence. And again, being on a cost-controlled contract, that is helpful to them, not only in terms of having someone locked up relatively long term, but also potentially in another move down the road. As I talked about earlier, this Memphis team has done a fantastic, I can't overstate, a fantastic job of rebuilding their roster. Obviously, there's luck involved in getting the number 2 overall pick and getting John Morant. This doesn't look nearly as impressive if they don't have Morant in terms of their current team. Jaren Jackson Jr. is an absolute stud. But when you think about the trade compensation that they got in exchange for guys like Mike Conley, Marc Gasol, that objectively you wouldn't think would have a ton of value, this is an awesome rebuild and start to the rebuild for them. I mean, they've got Jonas Valanciunas, who, is coming back as a result of the Marc Gasol trade. They've got 2 second-round picks as a result of trading away DeLon Wright. And in a roundabout way, you can basically just add Justise Winslow to what they got in exchange for Mike Conley, because they got Andre Iguodala as part of a weird situation there. They decided to keep him and not buy him out, and ended up getting themselves a really, really good asset in Winslow. And I hope that other teams see this down the road and say, hey, this guy has value when they're trading for veteran players. I don't really think that many teams are going to be looking to buy out their guys as often, at least if they're following a smart path and not just trying to save a little bit of money when whoever they're buying out actually does have value. Like, just think about the difference in this Grizzlies team right now compared to if they had just bought out Andre Iguodala. They wouldn't have Justise Winslow on their roster. Yes, they gave up guys like Jay Crowder and Solomon Hill that could potentially derail their season. Like, if Justise Winslow isn't healthy and they're losing key parts of their rotation, they've been playing really well lately. So there is certainly some risk in terms of their current season. But from a long-term outlook, I don't see how they could have done any better in an Andre Iguodala deal, considering they have 2 huge expirings now for next season and Winslow, which is better than a late first-round pick that they potentially would have gotten from another team. This is an awesome job by Memphis and a string of really great moves. And they've probably had the best front office moves. If I was giving out awards today in terms of the best job that a front office has done in the last year and a half, I would have to give it to Memphis. I can't say it enough. They have done a fantastic job, and I can't wait to see what they continue to do moving forward with this team. Really quickly before the video ends, let me give you guys a rundown of what we're going to be doing here coming up. So I don't necessarily know the order as of right now, but depending on what happens the rest of the day, I'm sure I'll review plenty more trades tomorrow. Then the day after that, probably some winners and losers from the trade deadline. The day after that, probably some like under the radar type deals like the Atlanta Dwayne Dedmon trade from yesterday, talking about some of those. And then I will come out with this Grizzlies video that I've been teasing this entire time about what could potentially be next, what this master plan could be for Memphis down the road. But there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.